In 1942, the tide turned against the Axis forces in Egypt and Libya. In October, after regrouping and resupplying, the British 8th Army launched a major attack near the town of El Alamein. 2 weeks later, an Anglo-American force landed in the Vichy French territories of Morocco and Algeria. In a series of engagements, fought over the course of the following 6 months, the Germans and their Italian allies were squeezed remorselessly from east and west. After rallying briefly and brilliantly to inflict heavy casualties on the pursuing American Second Corps at Kasserine, they were finally driven through Tunisia to the coast. The defeat of the Axis armies in North Africa was to prove a devastating blow to Italy. Hundreds of thousands of her finest young men were lost during the course of the campaign. In their efforts to supply them, the Italian Navy and Air Force were also virtually annihilated, rendering Italy herself vulnerable to invasion. The long struggle for North Africa, by providing American air, naval and ground forces with invaluable battle experience, paved the way for the eventual reconquest of Europe. Early Italian reverses against the British in Egypt and against the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean prompted Hitler to reinforce his Italian ally with 2 crack German divisions under the command of General Erwin Rommel. In February 1941, Rommel's Africa Corps began disembarking in the main Libyan port of Tripoli, and in March, before these formations were either fully assembled or equipped, he struck quickly eastwards into Cyrenaica. The British position in Cyrenaica hinged on Mersa Brega, a natural bottleneck on the coastal plain. But contingency plans existed for a withdrawal along the coast to Benghazi in the event of a major Axis offensive. The attack opened on March the 31st, and the British, conforming to plan, began withdrawing northwards that night. Rommel now divided his forces into 3 columns. One of these he sent along the coastal highway through Bed of Fom towards Benghazi, while the other 2 struck across the Cyrenaican plateau towards Derna and Tobruk. Faced with the threat of encirclement, the British abandoned any attempt to defend Benghazi and began a frantic retreat east. On April the 10th, Rommel reached Tobruk, and on the following day surrounded it on 3 sides. But for 7 months the port's garrison held out, reinforced and supplied by sea. In November, a British relief offensive, launched from the Egyptian frontier, finally broke through and cleared the Axis once again out of Cyrenaica. But the respite was to be only temporary. Rommel's failure to capture Tobruk had placed additional strains on his already stretched lines of communication. By withdrawing, these lines were shortened, and many of the problems of supply peculiar to the desert were overcome. Both sides faced the same fundamental problem. Everything had to be brought in, mostly by sea, and then carried through the desert to the front. There were few roads, and those that existed were narrow, crudely surfaced, and often cratered by airstrikes or detonated mines. The further one side advanced, the longer and more vulnerable grew its lines of communication, while those retreating shortened theirs and thus resupplied faster and more efficiently as they withdrew. Axis lines of communication stretched through Libya to Tripoli, and from there across the Mediterranean to Italy. Though much shorter than the tortuous route via South Africa and the Red Sea, by which supplies were sent to the British, the Mediterranean sea lanes were far more perilous. Between Italy and Libya lurked submarines and surface raiders of the Royal Navy. But the principal threat to Axis shipping came from British air patrols flying from Malta. The island was seen by both sides as the key to strategic control of the central Mediterranean. It had been bombed within hours of Italy's entry to the war, and plans had been drawn up for an Axis invasion. But in late 1941, a huge effort was mounted to starve the island into submission. Luftwaffe fighters and bombers, redeployed from Russia, joined those of the Italian Air Force in a murderous onslaught, both against Malta itself and against Allied convoys running supplies to the island. The renewed pressure on Malta brought a period of respite to the Axis convoys supplying Rommel. In January 1942, when enough supplies had been amassed and his depleted divisions adequately reinforced, he seized the opportunity to mount a quick counteroffensive. As they had been 9 months previously, the British were caught completely by surprise, and the costly gains they had won in the autumn were swept away as the Axis forces, spearheaded by the Afrika Korps, stormed back onto the Cyrenaican plateau. From early February through to May, both sides faced each other across a line running from Gazala on the coast to the fortified village of Bir Hakeim on the desert flank. On the British side, the front comprised fixed infantry positions protected by wire and minefields. Behind these were 5 tank brigades and 3 motorized infantry brigades, deployed on the open flank. For the coming offensive, Rommel deployed 2 armored and 1 motorized division, supported by 2 weak Italian armored divisions. These would be launched against the British positions in the south, on either side of Bir Hakeim. After a night march through the desert to the south of Bir Hakeim, the main Axis striking force swung northeast and crashed into the rear of the British positions. What followed was a furious and often uncoordinated series of skirmishes as opposing mobile formations wheeled and clashed over the battlefield. Gradually, German battle experience and their more effective use of armor and anti-tank weapons proved decisive, wearing down the British armor and overcoming their exposed infantry. By mid-June, after nearly 3 hard weeks of fighting, the Germans finally broke through and began driving towards Tobruk and the coast. The second siege of Tobruk lasted no more than a few days. Although well garrisoned, its defenses had either been neglected or stripped to provide depth for the Gazala line. By June the 21st, the port had fallen, netting Rommel more than 30,000 prisoners, as well as vast quantities of fuel, equipment, and supplies. From Tobruk, Rommel quickly resumed his advance eastwards, driving the British en route through Egypt. After a first disastrous stand at Mersa Matruh, the British fell back to the partially fortified Alamein line, 60 miles from Alexandria at the western end of the Nile Delta, and the last defensible position before the Nile itself. The Alamein position was a natural strategic bottleneck, where the coastal plain ended at the lip of a steep escarpment. At Alamein, the escarpment ran virtually parallel to the coast and marked the northern boundary of the Qattara Depression, a region of impassable salt marshes stretching deep into the interior. The Alamein line, as it existed in June 1942, consisted of a number of fortified boxes on the coastal plain, manned by infantry and supported in the rear by artillery and by what remained of the armoured and mobile forces. On June the 30th, as the British armour wheeled into position behind the infantry, leading elements of the Afrika Korps began arriving in the area immediately to the west. On the following day, as soon as sufficient force had been assembled, Rommel attacked, driving in through the centre of the front in a bid to outflank the Alamein box. Initially, the attack made good ground. German armoured spearheads advanced almost unopposed for 3 miles. But the British had redeployed for a more strategic defence, and when these defences were engaged, the attack quickly ran into difficulties. The British gun line proved devastatingly effective, and most of the fixed defences were resolutely held. The battle was also fought hundreds of miles from the main Axis airfields, and the RAF enjoyed almost complete mastery of the skies. After nearly a month of hard fighting, with no significant gains, Rommel broke off the attack. He had reached the limit of his logistical capabilities, and without a dramatic increase in supplies, he could go no further. The iron law of logistics would now work in favour of his enemies. From the outset of his appointment as Prime Minister of Britain in May 1940, Churchill's military successes against the Axis had been few. He had admittedly led his people with firmness and determination through the period of defensive struggle that became known as the Battle of Britain. But military victories in the field had eluded him. In North Africa, at the outset of the conflict with Italy, a British force led by General Richard O'Connor seized Cyrenaica in a brilliant campaign and seemed poised to eject the Italians from Libya. But Churchill squandered this opportunity by transferring troops to Greece in a wholly futile attempt to bolster the country's resistance to a Nazi invasion. The subsequent disaster that befell the British in Greece and on Crete, resulting in the loss of nearly 30,000 men, gravely weakened the British position in North Africa and paved the way for Rommel's subsequent victories in the theatre. The loss of Tobruk came as a particular embarrassment, undermining Churchill's credibility at home and abroad. If the situation could not be rescued by a British success at El Alamein, Churchill's reputation as a strategist would be ruined, and his stature as a world leader seriously damaged. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had threatened to embroil America in a purely Pacific conflict, a turn of events that both Roosevelt and Churchill were agreed would lead to a wasteful division of resources. But Hitler's declaration of war on America 4 days later enabled Roosevelt to advocate a strong military partnership with Britain and a concentration of resources in the European theater. Initially, Roosevelt pressed for a cross-channel attack on the French coast. But as America stirred herself for the tasks ahead, it became clear that the necessary men and arms for such an undertaking would not become available until 1943 at the earliest. In the short term, America could best support Britain by providing naval support to the Royal Navy in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and by sending air and ground forces to help the British in North Africa. Roosevelt's commitment to this strategy, once agreed, remained solid, even in the face of protests and criticisms from some of his senior military commanders. North Africa was only ever of peripheral concern to Hitler. He had become involved in the conflict out of loyalty to his ally Mussolini and his growing despair at the Italian army's failure to maintain even a posture of defense in the region. Indeed, the alliance with Italy was increasingly being seen as a liability, and Italian adventures had already involved him in 2 unwanted and distracting conflicts. The Balkan campaign had disrupted his preparations for the attack on Russia, and North Africa was a continuing drain on German resources. Moreover, Hitler was aware that until the war in Russia could be brought to a conclusion, he could not afford the men and equipment necessary to conquer Egypt and the Middle East. With these overriding concerns and little confidence in Italian arms, his instructions to Rommel lacked their usual vigor and aggression. Rommel's task was primarily to provide backbone and firepower for the Italian army and to bolster Italian defenses in the region. More alarmingly, Hitler took little real interest in Rommel's difficulties, gave him no clear objectives, and failed adequately to support his efforts to exploit British setbacks. When Mussolini brought Italy into the war in June 1940, he did so in the firm conviction that both Britain and France were on the verge of defeat, and that rich territorial concessions could be won easily and cheaply at their expense. He boasted of turning the Mediterranean into an Italian lake and of re-establishing the Roman Empire. But Mussolini's ambitions were far greater than anything his armed forces could reasonably be expected to achieve. In France, despite a hastily mounted offensive on the Alpine frontier, he achieved nothing, and in the Balkans, his army was easily defeated by the Greeks. The Mediterranean proved a similarly hostile theater, and after a series of setbacks involving the loss of 4 battleships and several cruisers, the surviving elements of the Italian fleet were restricted to coastal waters or occasional forays under heavy air protection. In Africa, Mussolini's attempts to profit from British weakness had also met with disaster. By the summer of 1941, he had lost Ethiopia, and what remained of his army was now under the command of a German general. If Rommel could not now deliver the elusive victories and the territorial conquests Mussolini had promised to the Italian people, his position as dictator might become untenable. The overall Allied strategy for the coming North African campaign was for mutually reinforcing offensives at either end of the continent. In the west, this would take the form of a seaborne invasion of the Vichy French territories of Morocco and Algeria. Prior to these landings, the British Eighth Army in Egypt would launch an attack on Rommel's positions to the west of El Alamein. If both operations were successful, the Axis forces in North Africa would be trapped and annihilated. The immediate objectives of the seaborne assault, codenamed Operation Torch, were 3 French North African ports outside the operational range of the Luftwaffe. The Algerian landings would be made on nearby beaches, and the ports of Oran and Algiers would then be taken by flank attack or by close investment. Landings in Morocco would take place at 3 different locations, those on the flank to deter relieving attacks from the north or south, while the centre group advanced on Casablanca. Once the ports had been captured and the harbour installations secured, follow-up convoys would begin unloading the necessary transport and supplies to enable the assault forces to strike out eastwards along the coast towards Tunisia. The ultimate objective for the expeditionary force was Tunis, a strategically vital port on the Tunisian coast. From here, the Allies could strike south towards Libya, or, through naval and air operations, completely sever the remaining Axis supply lines to Tripoli. The capture of Tunis would also render Sicily vulnerable to an Allied invasion, mounted from North African bases and supported by fighter squadrons based on Malta. While these plans were being drawn up, the British preparations for an offensive in Egypt were already underway. Reinforcements and supplies were flowing into Alexandria. One huge convoy, dispatched at the height of the crisis, brought more than 300 new tanks and self-propelled guns. Material superiority on the ground and in the air was considered essential to break through the hardening Axis defences and guarantee victory in any subsequent battle of manoeuvre. At Alamein, the main attack would be launched between Deir el-Shein and the coast, the most heavily fortified sector of the line. In the first phase, the infantry would advance behind a rolling artillery barrage, knocking out forward defences, strongpoints and command posts, and clearing 2 corridors through the minefield. The armour would then move through these corridors and fan out to take up positions about 2 miles further on. There they would adopt a defensive stand, deflecting and repelling the expected counterattacks by German armoured formations. Meanwhile, in the southern sector of the line, diversionary attacks would draw off Axis reserves and armour and prevent reinforcement of the northern sector. The critical, attritional phase of the battle would be fought principally by the infantry, crumbling the Axis defences in the north and destroying the mainly Italian infantry forces trapped behind the armoured screen. Once this had been achieved, the British would then be in a position to roll up the line north to south, or in the more likely event of an Axis withdrawal, launch their armour and mobile forces in hot pursuit through Egypt to Libya. Throughout much of 1942, Hitler's attention was focused almost exclusively on his Great Summer Offensive in southern Russia. The operation had begun well. Two army groups had attacked across the Donets, smashing aside the weak Russian front and sweeping on over the Don steppe, east towards the Volga, and south into the Transcaucasus. The plan offered a solution to more than one of Hitler's problems. By seizing Stalingrad and Astrakhan on the Volga, he would sever the landlines between Russia and the outside world, isolate the Caucasian oil fields, and thus strangle the Russian war effort. With the front securely anchored along the Don and the Volga, the Red Army would be powerless to prevent the Transcaucasus falling into German hands. The drive south would bring the Wehrmacht to the Persian frontier and open a new front against the British in the Middle East. This would dangerously compromise Britain's strategic position and compel a major redeployment of British forces from Egypt to Persia, thus weakening Montgomery's front at Alamein and undermining the security of the entire region. Rommel could only wait while this titanic struggle raged in the east. The awkward position in which he found himself in Egypt was largely of his own making. In seeking to exploit British disarray, he had disregarded orders to halt on the Egyptian frontier and pushed on to the very limit of his logistical capability. From Italy to Tripoli was a distance of 600 miles. From Tripoli to El Alamein was a further 1,400 miles, over which the bulk of his supplies had to travel. Fuel and transport, already at a premium, were being greedily consumed in the Herculean task of getting supplies to the front. More than half the Axis forces in Africa, from logistics personnel to anti-aircraft gunners, were engaged in this effort. What little actually reached Rommel was barely sufficient for defence. To compound these difficulties, the British Desert Air Force was gradually achieving mastery of the skies, and the final leg of the journey was becoming the most difficult and costly of all. Chronic shortages of fuel, equipment and supplies were to dictate not only Rommel's strategy at El Alamein, but his whole conduct of the campaign. The Axis defence lines at El Alamein consisted of extensive minefields, strewn with barbed wire, in such a way as to funnel attacking forces into predetermined lines of fire. The fixed defences varied between 2 and 5 miles in depth and incorporated pillboxes, concealed firing points and forward command posts. As the front wound its way southwards, it became weaker, and it was here that the main British attack was expected. To counter any breakthrough in this sector, Rommel had 4 armoured divisions, 2 German and 2 Italian, but all were gravely deficient in battle-worthy tanks and in men, and there was insufficient fuel for a battle of manoeuvre. The available armour was therefore widely spread and would be fed piecemeal into the battle to plug breaches in the line as and when they occurred. At the end of September, Rommel returned to Germany for medical treatment and to press the High Command for greater efforts to supply his army. But the tide of battle in the Mediterranean was remorselessly turning against the Axis. In September, British air and naval forces based on Malta had sunk 1/3 of all Italian merchantmen bound for Libya. In October, the figure would be closer to a half. Of the tonnage actually landed, a large part would be consumed by garrison and rear echelon units. More would be lost to Allied airstrikes. As the inevitable battle approached, the defenders could do little but stockpile frantically the few supplies that actually reached the front. In May 1940, General Bernard Montgomery was serving as a divisional commander with the British Expeditionary Force in Belgium. When the Belgian army unexpectedly capitulated on May the 28th, Montgomery's 3rd Division sealed the breach and made possible the retreat to Dunkirk. Recognition of his skill and determination was to ensure his promotion to Corps Commander, and after his return to England, he was charged with the defence of the Kent coast. To prepare for the threatened German invasion, Montgomery introduced a number of measures, such as hard training regimes and reduced leave for officers. Although initially unpopular, these measures helped to improve morale and brought the Corps to peak fighting condition. Montgomery arrived in Egypt on August 12, 1942. Though stabilized, 8th Army's front at Alamein was by no means secure, and his first task was to strengthen the defensive posture of the army and reinvigorate the troops. Montgomery brought to Egypt a reputation as a hard taskmaster. He was outspokenly critical of his predecessors, intolerant of their failings, and deaf to their advice. But he understood more clearly than they did the nature of the difficulties 8th Army faced and the pressing need for reorganizing and retraining before any major offensive could be launched. Within weeks of his arrival in Africa, Erwin Rommel was already building the reputation that would eventually establish him as one of the greatest battlefield commanders of World War II. Although trained as an infantry officer, he had quickly mastered the new science of armoured warfare, achieving distinction as a panzer commander in France before leading the Afrika Korps in a spectacular blitzkrieg through Libya. His energy, imagination, and tactical boldness, which had so thoroughly bewildered 8th Army, won him international respect. Even Churchill was forced to admit that successive 8th Army commanders had simply been outwitted and outmaneuvered, and 8th Army veterans had come to see Rommel as almost invincible. In 1942, after the capture of Tobruk, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army, and the culmination of a meteoric career. But recognition of his achievements was not accompanied by adequate reinforcements and an increased rate of supply. And without these, his operational freedom was severely constrained. At Alamein, he faced a cruel dilemma. He could neither advance nor safely retreat. Only by defeating 8th Army in the coming defensive battle could he continue to hold the line, while pinning his hopes on Hitler's vaunted offensive in the Caucasus. As a career staff officer in the pre-war American Army, Eisenhower's organizational talents quickly brought him to the attention of General George Marshall, the Army's Chief of Staff and Roosevelt's principal advisor and strategist. In Washington, Eisenhower served as Marshall's subordinate, in charge of operational planning, and in 1942, he was sent to England to coordinate the American build-up for an eventual cross-channel attack. When the decision was taken to mount Operation Torch with a proportion of these forces, Eisenhower was the natural choice as Commander-in-Chief. Although inexperienced as a battlefield commander, his undoubted talents for diplomacy and delegation were regarded as essential attributes for the first major joint operation between British and American forces. The Allied forces for the coming Battle of North Africa consisted of two separate components: the Expeditionary Force, destined for assault landings in Morocco and Algeria, and the 8th Army, facing Rommel in Egypt. While 8th Army's task was clearly defined, the invasion force faced a number of uncertainties. The operation itself had no precedent in modern military history, and no one could confidently predict how the French would react. A hostile reception could have catastrophic consequences. There was a shortage of assault and landing craft, and logistics planning for beachhead supply was seriously deficient. Moreover, the operation had been hastily mounted, and insufficient time had been available to train the assault troops properly in amphibious landings. Much would depend on the attitude of the French and the success or failure of Montgomery's offensive in Egypt. By the end of August, Montgomery had largely completed his primary task of bolstering the Alamein defenses, and a last despairing effort by the Axis forces had been effectively stonewalled. Throughout September and October, all efforts were directed at rebuilding 8th Army's strength and preparing it for the coming offensive. Planning and preparations emphasized the cooperation of all arms, the tactical role of each company and unit, and the expectations placed on individual officers and men. Comprehensive training programs were established to prepare the Army for the hard tasks ahead and to ensure the proper coordination of infantry and armor. The build-up of men and material continued steadily, and by October, 8th Army consisted of 10 fully equipped divisions, 3 of them armored. Montgomery now possessed overwhelming material superiority, not only on the ground, but in the air as well. The Desert Air Force had been heavily reinforced, and Allied air power was further augmented by the dispatch of American Air Force units to the Middle East. This tilted the balance of air power decisively against the Axis. As the 8th Army completed its final preparations, Allied airstrikes on Rommel's assembly areas and lines of communication became almost incessant. The American M3 medium tank was hastily commissioned in 1940 as an interim measure to provide the American Army with a tank comparable to those possessed by European powers. The result was a curious hybrid, half-tank, half-self-propelled gun. The main armament was a 75mm gun mounted in a right-hand sponson with a restricted traverse and capable of firing both high explosive and armor-piercing ammunition. The fully rotating turret mounted a 37mm anti-tank gun and a coaxial machine gun. The M3 entered service with the 8th Army early in 1942 and was known as a Grant. Despite its strange configuration, high profile and comparatively thin armor, the Grant quickly proved superior to all other existing British tanks, though it still fell far short of the best German machines. The British 6-pound anti-tank gun entered service in 1941. Hitherto, the Army had relied on a 2-pound weapon, which had proved ineffective in France and virtually useless against German face-hardened armor in North Africa. Like many British weapons, the 6-pounder suffered lengthy delays between design and production, and when it finally arrived, it was already being overtaken by improvements to German armored plate and by superior counter-engagement weapons. It also fired only uncapped shot, which had a tendency to shatter on impact. Nevertheless, the 6-pounder was a useful defensive weapon when dug in, and could defeat most German tanks at up to 1,000 yards. The 6-pounder's replacement, a 17-pound weapon, was already in production, but only a few of these would see service in North Africa. Entering service in 1937, the Hawker Hurricane was a remarkably good aircraft for its time and was the mainstay of the RAF's fighter squadrons during the Battle of Britain. But as a fighter, it quickly gave way to the Spitfire and was gradually re-equipped as a ground attack aircraft. The Mark II-C, which appeared in 1942, mounted 4 20mm cannons, and the D version, 2 40mm cannons and 2 machine guns. These aircraft were used extensively in North Africa against all sorts of targets, including shipping, supply columns and tanks. By October, Hurricanes equipped 13 squadrons of the Desert Air Force, and although not all were yet cannon armed, most were, and they were already sowing havoc behind the lines. The 8th Army and its predecessor, the Western Desert Force, had fought under 6 different commanders in less than 2 years. Constant changes of command, endless restructuring, and the loss of thousands of their comrades in a succession of avoidable disasters had combined to bewilder and demoralize 8th Army's officers and men. Yet if the Army could be taught to believe in itself again, and was properly trained and prepared for the tasks ahead, Montgomery knew it had the experience, equipment, and manpower to win a decisive victory at Alamein. As the weeks passed, and it became clear that Montgomery knew his job and respected his soldiers, 8th Army quickly recovered both its strength and its morale. Of those forces destined for French North Africa, fully 3/4 were American. In contrast to Montgomery's veterans, they were full of confidence and enthusiasm, but many had only been partially trained, and the American army still lacked cohesion and discipline. How they would perform in the field had yet to be seen. In August 1941, the German Afrika Korps and the Italian 21st Corps were combined under unified command to become Panzer Group Africa. In January of the following year, the group was augmented by a further 2 Italian corps and 1 German mechanized division, and redesignated as Panzer Army Africa. Although theoretically a mechanized force, the Army's mobility was constrained both by chronic problems of supply and by its large Italian infantry component. Indeed, so great were the Army's demands and so meagre its resources that for long periods of time it was entirely dependent on captured enemy supplies and equipment. By August 1942, fully 85% of its transport consisted of British and American vehicles, and British rations, fuel, and even heavy weapons all played their part in sustaining the Panzer Army in the field. Yet despite these deficiencies, the Army remained a formidable fighting machine. Its German component and its overall German leadership, which gave it vigor and tactical flair in offense, would ensure commitment, resolution, and courage in the coming defensive battle. The Mark III was originally designed to a 1935 specification for a main battle tank, intended for armored combat. Mass production began in 1939, and the tank saw service in Poland and France. But the 37mm gun proved ineffective against Soviet tanks and was soon replaced by a 50mm weapon. Armor thickness was also increased, and technical improvements made to the quality of the plate. Although the Mark III was progressively outclassed in the East and relegated to the role of support tank, huge numbers were sent to Africa, where they provided the bulk of the Afrika Korps' armored strength. The Mark III Special entered service in 1942 and was the last significant version of the model. Mounting a long-barreled 50mm gun, face-hardened armor, and extra plates, the Mark III remained in production until 1943 and served with distinction throughout the African campaign. The Italian army entered the war with a tank totally unsuited to its prescribed role. The M1340 and its later variant, the M1441, evolved from a series of light tanks with which Italian tank development had been mostly concerned. Lightly armored and underpowered, the tank was only really effective against soft targets. Indeed, in its general configuration, it betrayed design influences which were more suited to a colonial policing role than modern armored warfare. The 47mm gun, although adequate in 1940, could not be upgraded, and the 4-man tank carried an excessive number of machine guns. Early models also lacked desert filters, and their engines suffered heavily from the corrosive effect of sand. Large numbers were captured intact after having broken down, and were pressed into predictably short service by the British. M13s and 14s equipped 3 Italian armoured divisions, all of whom would see service in North Africa. The 88 entered service with the Wehrmacht in 1933 as a high-velocity anti-aircraft gun, but by 1942 had become the most feared anti-tank gun in the German arsenal. Although the 88 was first used against ground targets during the war in Spain, it was Rommel who first recognized the true potential of the 88 as an anti-tank weapon, employing it in adversity in France, and then modifying it for use as a pure anti-tank gun in North Africa. Whereas the British had always regarded anti-tank guns as defensive weapons, Rommel employed them in an offensive role, attaching mobile batteries to panzer groups. Time and again, British tank formations would be drawn into pursuing retreating German armour, only to find themselves impaled on a screen of 88s. In 1940, in the skies over Britain, the Junkers 87, or Stuka, had suffered heavily when engaged by single-engine fighters. But in ill-defended skies, it still remained a truly awesome weapon. As a dive bomber, the Stuka was highly accurate, and its attack sirens added terror to its more conventional repertoire. In the first years of the war, the screaming Stuka had achieved international notoriety and a reputation far beyond its actual capabilities. In North Africa, it had often benefited from German air superiority, and in such conditions was employed to devastating effect. In 1941, an improved version was brought into service, which had greater armour protection, a more powerful engine, and an increased payload. At Alamein, where the RAF held dominance in the air, the Stuka would not play a major role, but in support of an Axis withdrawal or against Allied forces in French North Africa, it was still capable of inflicting serious damage. Despite the recent setbacks at Alamein and the approaching British offensive, the German soldiers in Rommel's Panzer Army remained confident of his leadership. Many were campaign veterans who had grown accustomed to the hardships and privations of desert service. They were generally well-trained, courageous and professional, and regarded themselves as an elite. Replacements, when they arrived, were incorporated within existing formations and units, learning the tricks of desert living and the techniques of survival from their comrades. But at Alamein, these normally difficult conditions were exacerbated by a serious water shortage. Virtually no fresh water was available at the front. Most of what there was came from old wells and storage systems on the desert coast and was often polluted. Water rations were barely sufficient for the army's needs. Drinking water was in short supply, and there was little left for washing or sanitation. Personal hygiene suffered, and jaundice and dysentery were common. Yet if the Germans were able to endure these difficulties with fortitude, the same could not be said of their comrades in arms. Italian morale had all but collapsed. The obvious inferiority of their equipment and the humiliations they had endured at the hands of the British were compounded now by disillusion, epidemics, and the recognition that they had become very much the junior partners in the alliance. It was these ill-equipped and predominantly infantry troops that would have to bear much of the force of Montgomery's planned offensive in the northern sector. As the final contest for North Africa loomed, Hitler's campaign in southern Russia was grinding slowly to a halt. The drive to the Volga had become bogged down in a desperate battle for the city of Stalingrad. And in the Transcaucasus, the retreating Red Army had established a defensive front among the ridges and peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. The range stretched east to west for nearly 700 miles, and the few mountain passes that existed were heavily defended. By October, snow and ice had made them virtually impregnable. There was now no prospect of a drive south into Persia in 1942.